What's up, AP Psych? Here we are again in Unit 8, Motivation, Emotion, and Stress. We finished up our motivation topics. Now we're going to move on to our first topic in terms of emotion and the various different theories of emotion. So for this one, it's going to be very important that you take down some of these examples that we talk about, use them for your vocabulary. We know examples can be very helpful in terms of preparing for and remembering the different levels and different styles and theories of emotion. So let's get started. First off, emotions are kind of a mix of a few things. We have a physiological activation or a physiological response, right? Your heart starts racing, you start sweating, whatever that may be. You have a physiological response, then you express behaviors, and you have a conscious experience, right? So that physiological response, and then you think about what's happening. You have some type of thought process that occurs, and then you express a behavior after it. Okay, so all of these things play a role in our emotions and how we experience them and express ourselves. And we will talk about in our next couple videos expressing emotion and experiencing emotion a little bit more in depth. So there's first theory that we need to talk about. It's called the James-Lange Theory. So William James and Carl Lang were kind of like the first to put forth a theory on emotion. And they proposed an idea that was completely opposed to the common sense view of the day. So they're kind of going against what many people thought as common sense. James Lang, they proposed that physiological activity precedes our emotional experience. Okay, so what that means is our bodily changes ultimately cause you to feel emotions. So they would say there's some type of event or stimulus. Then there's a physiological arousal, right? When we talk about that, we're talking about your body's response to things. Maybe you start sweating, like we said, your heart starts racing, or something like that. You feel anxiety, and that leads to the experience of some type of emotion like fear or anger or joy, right? So let's get an example. So you're watching TV one evening, and when a face appears in the window of your living room, right? Your heart starts racing, your palms sweat, you jump, right? And then you feel afraid. That would be what James Lang claims happens when you experience emotion. Something happens to you, you have a physiological response, and then you feel afraid. Okay. So the difficult part about these theories of emotion is remembering the different psychologists and how their theory relates. So we got to think of some ways to try to organize this in our mind. Some clever ways. We have a couple for another one down the road here, but James Lang, we don't really have an easy way to remember this, right? But they say you have this physiological response, then you experience an emotion. Okay. After they put forth that idea, Walter Cannon and Philip Bard kind of questioned it. And they said, I don't know if that's really true. And they proposed that an emotion triggering stimulus and the body's arousal take place at the same time. Okay. So they would say you have this event or this stimulus, and you have a physiological arousal, your heart starts racing, you start sweating, and your emotion are felt at the same time. They happen simultaneously. Okay. So there is some thought and proof to this because the thalamus produces both physical and emotional responses simultaneously as it sends messages to your autonomic nervous system and cerebral cortex at the same time. Okay, so one way you can remember the Cannon-Bard theory, if there's ever a question about the thalamus and its role in emotion, you can be pretty sure that it is asking you about the Cannon-Bard theory. Okay, so this touches back to our Unit 3 material and knowing that the thalamus is like our sensory switchboard, our sensory traffic cop, sending information to where it needs to go so our body can respond appropriately. Well, it sends that information, that stimulus, to our autonomic nervous system and our cerebral cortex at the same time. And that's why Cannon-Bard stated they think those things happen simultaneously. So just for that example again, let's say someone grabs your shoulder from behind, you're walking down the hallway in school, somebody grabs you, right? You kind of tense up, like, oh, and you feel surprised. Cannon-Bard would say, yeah, that's a simultaneous event. You're feeling both muscle tension and surprise at the very same time. So next up, we have the two-factor theory. And this was another one, just third level here, was put forth by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer. And they proposed yet another theory which suggested that our physiology and our cognition create emotion. Okay, so emotions have two factors, physical arousal and a cognitive label in order to feel the emotion. So Cannon-Bard said we have physiological arousal and emotion at the same time. Schachter and Singer are adding a second step, right? They say you have a physiological arousal, and then you interpret that arousal through the environmental cues around you, through cognition, and then you feel an emotion. Okay. One easy way to remember this, that's always helped me, if you see two-factor theory, it rhymes with Schachter, right? Schachter two-factor. So you might see a question about two-factor theory, and you remember that, oh, Schachter two-factor. There's two factors to this. There's psychological or physiological arousal, your interpretation or your cognition of the environment around you, the way you think about your environment, and then you feel your emotion. So Schachter two-factor is a great way to remember that. If you ever see the Schachter-Singer theory, you can remember it's Schachter two-factor and vice versa. So here's an example you could write down. So a man is approaching you in a dark alley, right? That's going to probably lead to your heart racing, sweaty palms, things like that, right? Which would, you'd think, be the same emotion as fear. But you're interpreting your situation cognitively. You're thinking, you realize that it's just your Uncle Steve walking towards you, right? So while your heart may be racing, it's actually an excitement over the fact that you're seeing your uncle for the first time in 5 years, right? That's a weird example, but it works because heart racing, sweaty palms can tell us that you're in fear or you have excitement, right? They kind of have the same physiological response. So you have to have that cognitive appraisal of the situation to understand the emotion that you're feeling. Okay, so we kind of just mentioned this, but the physiological responses are pretty much similar across emotions of fear, anger, love, and boredom, right? Which makes it interesting. It's hard for our body to understand without cognitively appraising the situation, which of these emotions we're feeling, if they all have very similar physiological responses, right? Excitement and fear involve very similar things. So if you look at these two faces, these guys are riding this roller coaster. And I asked you, which one do you think is experiencing fear and which ones do you think is experiencing excitement? You could probably tell me, but they're going through the exact same physiological response, but they're having completely different emotions. So Schachter and Singer would say there has to be some cognitive appraisal or labeling of the situation and the environmental cues so that you can feel a specific emotion. So in addition, physical responses like finger temperature and your facial muscles can change during fear, rage, and joy. Okay. Also, our amygdala shows differences in activation during emotions of anger and rage, which we might consider to be similar emotions, but our brain reacts differently while we're feeling them. Also, activity in our left hemisphere, there's a lot of lighted up activity when we experience happiness. However, when you experience depression or sadness, your right hemisphere lights up. Okay, so we can see these differences in emotion in the physiological, actual like brain and body responses. Even though some of them have similarities, there are differences that we can pick out when studied more closely. So, getting a little bit deeper into cognition and emotion. Okay, so what is the connection between how we think and how we feel? Okay, can we change our emotions by changing our thinking? We talked briefly about this when we'll go into more deeply when we talk about stress. You can change the way your body reacts by the way you interpret and the way you think about a situation. So that's kind of like the Cannon-Bard, Schachter-Singer theories. They say there has to be, just Schachter-Singer says there has to be some cognitive appraisal of the situation. And so there's a couple schools of thought in terms of cognition and emotion that we need to touch on here. So there's two routes. James-Lange and Ledoux emphasize that some emotions are immediate without conscious appraisal. Right? And they say that we have some of these emotions and we don't even think about it. If you ever experienced this, maybe you've gotten upset, and then after that upset feeling passes, you're like, why did I get so upset? I don't know why that happened, right? Whereas Lazarus teamed up with Schachter-Singer, and they emphasize that appraisal, that Schachter two-factor, also can determine our emotions. So James-Lange and Ledoux would say event happens and we have an emotional response in some situations without thinking. Whereas Lazarus and Schachter-Singer would say there's an event, we interpret, we think about the situation, we appraise our environment, and then we have an emotional response. Okay, so those are the two different trains of thought in terms of cognition and emotion. So let's go a little deeper into each one. James-Lange argues that emotional reaction can be quicker than our interpretation of a situation. So we feel before we think. Okay. So for example, if you feel scared when you walk in the woods and you hear a twig crack, right? You hear that crack, and before you have time to think about it, you're like, oh no, maybe I'm in danger. Okay. And this is supported somewhat by research on neurological processes that show that some neural pathways involved in emotion bypass the cortical areas, the higher level thinking areas. Um, for example, one pathway runs from our eyes and our ears via the thalamus to our amygdala. So there's a direct connection between what we see and hear straight to our sensory switchboard. And this shortcut enables quick precognitive emotional responses before our thinking or our intellect can intervene. So in some situations, our emotions can bypass our cognition and our thinking. We can experience them before we have time to think, which I think all of you can think about a time when you've experienced an emotion immediately. And then afterwards you think about it and you're like, I shouldn't have reacted that way, or I shouldn't have gotten so upset, or things like that. So that's one way. The cognition kind of comes after our emotion. We feel before we think, is what James-Lange would say. On the other hand, you have Lazarus, who worked with Schachter Singer. So the Schachter two-factor theory is very similar to this. But they argue that while our brain does process a lot unconsciously, even instantaneously felt emotions require some sort of cognitive appraisal of the situation. So otherwise, how do we know what we're responding to? Okay. So this appraisal may be effortless and it may not be totally conscious of. You may not be conscious of it, but it's still happening. So if we go back to that twig crack that you hear when you're walking through the woods, you have time to appraise the situation as one that is dangerous in order to feel scared in the first place. Okay, so it's kind of like context. So he would say, depending on which woods you're walking in. Are you walking in the woods behind your home where you feel safe? If you hear that twig crack, you're not going to be afraid because you are already interpreting the situation that you're in. But let's say your car breaks down on the side of the road and you have to walk to the nearest farmhouse through a small patch of trees, and you hear a twig crack. That could lead to fear because your cognitive appraisal of the situation is different. You're more on edge because it's a place you don't know. It might be dangerous. So they would say there is, even if it's unconscious, cognitive appraisal of every situation that could give you some context to the emotion that you should be feeling in that situation. All right. So I know we threw a lot of names at you there. We have one last thing. There are different dimensions of emotion, and our emotions have two different dimensions specifically: valence and arousal. So valence meaning positive or negative emotions, and arousal feeling that like level that your body is engaged, the physiological response. Is it a high physiological response, or do you have low arousal, a low physiological response? You're not too into it, you're not engaged in it. So you have different situations you can experience. If you have positive emotions, you can experience a high physiological response. You could be euphoric and elated, or you could be very calm and relaxed and positive feelings still. Right. The same with the negative side, bored or sluggish. When you have negative feelings, but you're not too, the situation isn't engaging your body. You're not having a physiological response to it. Or you can be alarmed and angry. Your heartbeat increases, your autonomic nervous system goes up. That's high arousal, right? And negative feelings of anger. Okay. So these are different dimensions of emotion. If you hear anyone talk about valence and arousal, you know that they're talking, those two things go together to into our experience of emotion. Okay. So I know there are a lot of names there, a lot of theories of emotion, a lot of things to keep straight. We'll talk about some examples in class and try to make sure we differentiate them for you so that you're able to, if they show up on an FRQ or something like that, or you need to explain them, you'd be able to do that very well. All right. Let me know if you have any questions.